The knock came again, harder this time, and the boy flinched. "Daddy," he whispered, fingers tightening in the fabric of his hoodie. "Don't open it." The young father stood frozen in the narrow hallway, one hand still gripping the screwdriver he hadn't put away since morning. The apartment smelled like cheap soup and sawdust. The door in front of him, the same one he had fixed 2 days ago across the hall, now seemed heavier, as if it knew what waited outside. "Police," a voice said, calm but firm. "Open the door, sir." The boy's breathing turned shallow. His eyes darted to the floor, to the peeling paint, to anything but the handle. The father swallowed, feeling the dull ache in his wrist, where the screw had slipped and cut him that afternoon. He hadn't even charged her. He'd just tightened the hinges, replaced the lock, and smiled when she said thank you like it mattered more than money. "Daddy, please," the boy whispered again, barely sound at all. The knocking stopped. Silence rushed in, thick and uncomfortable, pressing against the walls. Somewhere down the hall, a baby cried. Pipes rattled. A television murmured behind another door. Ordinary sounds. Too ordinary. The father rested his forehead against the wood. He could still remember the way the neighbor's hands shook while holding the broken lock. The way she kept glancing over her shoulder. The way she said, "I don't feel safe," like it was an apology. "Sir," the voice returned, closer now. "We just need to talk." The father straightened. He looked down at his son, too small for fear this big, and forced a breath into his chest. His fingers wrapped around the handle. And for the first time since fixing that door, he wondered if helping had been a mistake. He wasn't always this careful with his emotions, but life had taught him to be quiet inside. The young father lived in a second-floor apartment that always felt smaller at night. Not because of the walls, but because silence had a way of pressing in once his son was asleep. During the day, he worked, cooked simple meals, fixed things when they broke. At night, he sat still, listening to the building breathe, avoiding memories that came too easily if he let himself slow down. He carried his pain the way some people carry spare change, loose, uncounted, always there but never looked at directly. The past wasn't something he revisited on purpose. It existed in small habits, double-checking locks, keeping lights on longer than necessary, flinching at raised voices. He told himself it was just responsibility. Just being a father. What he avoided most was the thought that one wrong decision could ripple outward. That being kind could cost more than he could afford. He'd learned, the hard way, that trouble often arrived wearing an ordinary face. So he stayed neutral. Polite. Helpful only when it felt safe. Except it rarely ever did. He loved his son with a quiet intensity, the kind that doesn't announce itself. No big promises. Just presents. Packed lunches. Repaired toys. A steady hand on a small back during bad dreams. He didn't talk about the night everything changed for them. He just made sure it never happened again. And maybe that's why this story matters. Because if you've ever lived like that, doing your best, keeping your head down, hoping the world doesn't notice you, then you already understand him. You understand the kind of person who fixes a broken door without asking questions, who believes small acts shouldn't carry heavy consequences. If this feels familiar, stay with me. Not because something dramatic is about to happen, but because sometimes the quietest lives are the ones that get tested the hardest. The problem with broken things was that they demanded attention, even when life was already full. It started in the late afternoon, when the young father was helping his son with homework at the small kitchen table. Pencils were scattered, eraser crumbs dusted the page, and the boy kept glancing toward the door every time footsteps passed in the hallway. A soft knock interrupted them. It wasn't urgent. Not loud. Just enough to be noticed. When he opened the door, the neighbor stood there holding a loose metal lock in her hand like it might fall apart if she gripped it too tightly. She looked tired in the way people do when they haven't slept properly for days. Her eyes flicked toward the stairwell behind her before settling back on him. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I know it's late, but my door won't close right." He hesitated. Not because he didn't know how to fix it, he did, but because hesitation had become his instinct. He thought of his son behind him, thought of dinner on the stove, thought of how easily small favors turned into obligations. "It won't take long," she added, almost apologetic. "I just don't feel safe." That was the moment. Not the broken lock. Not the loose screws. That sentence. He felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the quiet warning that always surfaced when he was about to step outside his careful routines. He could say no. He could recommend the landlord. He could close the door and return to fractions and spelling words. Instead, he glanced back at his son. The boy was watching from the table, wide-eyed, saying nothing. Just waiting. "Give me 5 minutes," the father said. It wasn't a promise. It was barely a commitment. He grabbed his old toolbox from under the sink and followed her across the hall. The corridor smelled faintly of cleaning chemicals and something burnt. Her apartment was dim, curtains half drawn even though the sun hadn't set yet. The door told its story quickly. Bent hinge. Stripped screws. A lock that had been forced more than once. He worked quietly, kneeling on the worn carpet, tightening metal, replacing what he could. The neighbors stood nearby, arms folded, breathing shallow. Every sound in the building made her tense. "You don't have to do this," she said, voice low. "I know," he replied. That was the truth. He didn't have to. But when the door finally closed properly, solid, firm, secure, something shifted inside him. Not relief. Not pride. Responsibility. She thanked him more than once. He waved it off, already backing away. No money exchanged hands. No names shared. Just a nod, a closed door, and the feeling that something had quietly locked into place. Back in his own apartment, his son looked up. "Is she okay?" the boy asked. The father paused before answering. "I think she will be," he said. And as he put the toolbox away, he didn't realize that this small, ordinary decision had already started moving things he could no longer stop. Life didn't change all at once. That was what made it unsettling. The next morning began the same way it always did. The young father woke before his alarm, moved quietly through the apartment, and packed his son's lunch with the same care he gave everything else. Peanut butter sandwich. Apple slices. A folded note with a simple smile drawn in pen. Ordinary things. Safe things. But when they stepped into the hallway, his eyes went instinctively to the door across from theirs. It was closed. Still. Intact. His son noticed the look. "Did you fix it good?" the boy asked as they walked toward the stairs. "I fixed it," he replied, careful with his words. At the bottom of the stairs, the neighbor stood waiting, keys in hand. She froze when she saw them, then offered a small, uncertain smile. Nothing was said at first. Just a shared pause that felt heavier than it should have. "Good morning," she finally said. "Morning," he answered. The exchange lasted seconds, but it lingered long after they'd gone separate ways. At work, he caught himself replaying it. The way she'd looked relieved. The way his son had stood a little closer to him afterward, as if something invisible had shifted. That afternoon, his son tripped on the front steps after school and scraped his knee. It wasn't bad, just enough to sting, but the boy held back tears until they were inside. The father cleaned the cut slowly, methodically, while the boy stared at the wall. "Does helping people make things worse?" the boy asked suddenly. The question landed wrong. Too precise. Too early. What do you mean? The father said. The boy shrugged. Sometimes when I help, I get in trouble. The father taped the bandage in place and rested his hand on his son's knee a second longer than necessary. He didn't have an answer ready. He settled for the truth he could manage. Helping doesn't cause the trouble, he said. It just means you're there when it shows up. That night, there was a knock on their door again, softer than before. When he opened it, the neighbor stood holding a small plate wrapped in foil. I just wanted to say thank you, she said, for yesterday. He hesitated, then stepped aside. It felt like crossing a line he hadn't drawn on purpose. She didn't come in far, just enough to hand him the plate. Their fingers brushed. Both pulled back too quickly. His son peeked around the corner. Hi, the boy said. She smiled at him in a way that was careful but genuine. Hi. After she left, the apartment felt different. Not louder. Not brighter. Just occupied. The father sat at the table, staring at the plate of food growing cold, aware of something fragile forming in the space between them. Later, as he locked the door for the night, he checked it twice. Not because it felt unsafe, but because now there was more to lose. The days settled into a quiet pattern that none of them named, but all of them felt. The young father began leaving his apartment door open in the mornings while tying his son's shoes. Not wide open, just enough. Across the hall, the neighbor's door did the same. Sometimes they exchanged a nod. Sometimes nothing at all. It was enough. On Wednesday, the elevator broke. They took the stairs together without planning to. The boy skipped steps, counting out loud. The neighbor walked behind him, one hand hovering near the railing, the other ready to catch him if he slipped. The father noticed, said nothing, and slowed his pace to match theirs. Later that week, rain soaked the city without warning. The father arrived home late, his jacket damp, his son half asleep on his shoulder. The hallway light flickered as he struggled with his keys. Before he could curse under his breath, a hand reached past him and turned the knob on the shared hallway light. The neighbor stood there, barefoot, holding a towel. Here, she said softly. He took it. Their eyes met briefly. Something unspoken passed between them. Not gratitude, not obligation, but recognition. The towel returned the next morning, folded neatly, placed on his doorknob. His son started leaving small drawings outside her door. Stick figures. Houses. Doors with big locks drawn in heavy lines. The neighbor never commented on them, but they disappeared by evening, replaced sometimes by a piece of fruit, or a note with a smiley face drawn in the corner. One night, the boy had a nightmare. Nothing loud. Just a quiet whimper that pulled the father from sleep. He sat on the edge of the bed, rubbing his son's back, whispering reassurances he'd said many times before. The crying didn't stop. From the hallway came a soft knock. He opened the door to find the neighbor holding a glass of water, her eyes tired but steady. She didn't ask questions. She didn't step inside. She just handed him the glass and waited until the boy's breathing slowed. Thank you, the father whispered. She nodded, then turned back to her apartment. The next morning, he fixed the loose hinge on his own door. It had been squeaking for months. He oiled it carefully, testing it until it closed without a sound. Across the hall, her door opened once, then shut again, firm and quiet. They never talked about why she was afraid. He never explained why he avoided attachments. But the building began to feel less hollow, less temporary. On Friday evening, as the boy brushed his teeth, the father caught his own reflection in the bathroom mirror. Tired, guarded, but softer around the eyes. For the first time in a long while, he didn't immediately look away. And somewhere beneath the calm routine, something fragile held, strong enough to matter, weak enough to break. The police came on a quiet afternoon. Not with sirens. Not with urgency. Just two officers standing at the end of the hallway, notebooks in hand, voices low enough to blend into the building's usual hum. The young father noticed them through the peephole first, his stomach tightening before his mind caught up. His son was on the floor, lining up toy cars, humming softly. "Daddy?" the boy said, sensing the shift in the air. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," the father replied too quickly. He rested a hand on the door, feeling the old wood under his palm, remembering how easily it had moved when he'd fixed the hinge across the hall. The knock came, firm, controlled. When he opened the door, the officers asked his name, asked how long he'd lived there, asked if he knew the woman across the hall. "She's my neighbor," he said. "That's all." They exchanged a glance. One of them nodded and wrote something down. "We're following up on a report," the taller officer said, "about a break-in attempt. She mentioned someone helped secure her door recently." The father felt his throat tighten. He hadn't thought of that moment as anything more than kindness. He hadn't considered that it might be remembered, documented. "Did you touch the lock?" the officer asked. "Yes," he answered. His son had stood up now, pressed close to his leg, small fingers curling into his jeans. The officer noticed him and softened his tone. "We just need to be thorough." They left after a few more questions, promising to return if needed. The hallway returned to normal, but the air felt thinner. That evening, the neighbor knocked on his door. She looked smaller somehow, like the walls had moved closer around her. "I didn't know they'd come to you," she said immediately. "I told them the truth, that you just helped." He nodded, unsure what to say. "I should tell you something," she continued, voice unsteady. "The man who tried to get in, he's my ex-husband. He doesn't live here anymore. He wasn't supposed to know where I moved." The words landed quietly, but they rearranged everything. The late curtains, the shallow breathing, the way she watched the stairwell. The father felt his chest ache, not with fear, but with understanding. "I have a restraining order," she said, "but he keeps finding ways." From behind him, his son spoke up, barely above a whisper. "You fixed the door so he couldn't come in." The neighbor's eyes filled. She nodded once. "Yes," she said. "I did." The father looked down at his son. In that moment, the choice he'd made stopped being small. It stopped being about tools or hinges or favors. It became about protection. Not bravery. Not heroism. Just one parent quietly recognizing another, and standing in the space between danger and a child who deserved to feel safe. The second knock came 3 nights later. It was late enough that the hallway lights had dimmed, late enough that the building held its breath between sounds. The young father was rinsing dishes when he heard it, one sharp rap against the neighbor's door. Then another. He froze. His son was on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, eyes half closed. The television murmured quietly. Everything ordinary. Everything fragile. The knock came again. Harder. The father turned off the faucet. The silence that followed was loud. He walked to his own door, rested his hand against it, and listened. From across the hall came the low scrape of metal against metal. Testing. Pressing. His son sat up. "Daddy," he whispered. The old instinct surged first. Stay still. Don't get involved. Protect what's yours by shrinking. He felt it clearly now, that familiar pull to disappear. Then he remembered his son's drawings taped to a door. The way the neighbor had stood barefoot in the rain with a towel. The glass of water in the dark. He moved. Without raising his voice, he stepped into the hallway and positioned himself between the stairwell and her door. He didn't rush. He didn't shout. He simply existed there, visible, grounded. "Can I help you?" he said. The man turned. Older than he'd imagined. Thinner. His eyes flicked past the father, toward the door behind him. "She's not answering," the man said. "I just want to talk." The father didn't argue. He didn't explain. He reached into his pocket and took out his phone. "I'm calling the police," he said calmly. The man scoffed, took a step forward. The father didn't step back. Behind him, his own door opened a fraction. His son stood there, watching, not afraid, just alert. The man's eyes landed on the boy. Something shifted. He muttered under his breath and backed away toward the stairs. The hallway felt quiet again. The police arrived minutes later. This time, there were no questions for the father. Just nods. Just confirmation. Just a sense of finality. After they left, the neighbor opened her door. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She simply rested her forehead against the doorframe and let out a breath she'd been holding too long. The father stood nearby, hands at his sides. "I'll fix anything else that needs fixing," he said. She smiled, small and tired. "I know." Later that night, the father tucked his son into bed. The boy reached for his hand. "You didn't hide," the boy said sleepily. The father squeezed his fingers once. "No," he said. "I didn't." And as he turned off the light, he realized something had finally changed. Not the world outside, but the way he stood inside it. Sunday mornings became quieter after that. Not emptier, just settled. The young father stood at the stove, flipping pancakes while his son sat at the table coloring carefully inside the lines. The hallway beyond their door carried familiar sounds now. Footsteps, a radio playing somewhere down the corridor, the soft click of a door locking and unlocking without panic. A knock came. This time, no one flinched. The neighbor stood there holding a small bag of groceries. Bread, eggs, coffee. She didn't explain. She didn't need to. He stepped aside, and she placed the bag on the counter like she'd done it before. The boy looked up. "Can I help?" he asked. She smiled. "I'd like that." They ate together without ceremony. No speeches. No heavy glances. Just shared plates and small talk about school, about the weather, about nothing important. The kind of nothing that only feels safe when something important has already been protected. After breakfast, the father walked his son to the park at the end of the block. The neighbor followed a few steps behind, hands in her pockets, breathing easy. The boy ran ahead, laughing, stopping to wait for them when he got too far. At the crosswalk, the father held his son's hand. When the light changed, the neighbor stepped in beside them, close enough that their shoulders brushed. No one pulled away. Later, as the sun climbed higher, the father returned home and closed his door. He checked the lock once. Just once. He sat on the couch, listening to the building settle around him, feeling something unfamiliar but welcome take root in his chest. Not relief. Not victory. Belonging. If you've ever learned to live small to survive, you know how hard it is to unlearn that. How quiet courage doesn't announce itself. It just shows up again the next day. And if you're still here, sharing this moment, maybe you're looking for that kind of calm too. Stay close. Some stories don't end. They continue, softly,